All right, I'm going to get straight into it. Before we do, I need to just talk about what actually makes an exercise athletic. What makes an exercise athletic is it has a direct needle moving quality upon your athleticism. By which I mean, is this exercise going to directly cause an increase in your ability to produce outputs, sprinting faster, jumping higher, lifting heavier, or just making you have a better capacity to produce athletic outputs? The reasoning why I'm creating this list is so that you have a hierarchy of exercises, so that you understand what is going to move the needle for your athleticism and what isn't. There's a lot of misinformation out there when it comes to increasing your athleticism, especially on social media, Instagram, YouTube. Rather than making this list incredibly long with all of the thousands or even infinite variations of every different type of exercise, for example, with squatting or bilateral squatting, there are many different types of bar placement. There are many different types of implement that you could use. You got safety bar, zercher, front squat, back squat. Basically, what I've decided to do is to lump exercises into broad categories that enable you to still distinguish between them, but broad enough so that you're able to encompass like a gross movement pattern, for instance. So instead of having all these million different types of squatting variations with different types of bar and implements, all I've done is define it as bilateral squatting, or for example, bilateral pressing. So one good question to ask if you're not sure about an exercise or a category or a tier of exercises is, how much would my program suffer if I entirely eradicated this tier of exercises from my programming for myself or my athletes? How much would my athletes suffer if they weren't able to do this particular type of exercise or this entire tier of exercises? If you removed the entirety of the D tier from your programming, then that would mean that your programming probably wouldn't suffer that much. You could get away with just doing S tier, A tier, B tier, and C tier. However, if you entirely removed S tier exercises or a couple of the exercises from S tier from your programming, then your programming would definitely suffer in the context of athletic development. And one more caveat before I get into this, there's no such thing as bad exercises. They're just tools. Exercises are tools that you can use for different purposes. Obviously, for the purpose of health and longevity, some of the exercises on this list will be absolutely fantastic and better than others. However, in the context of developing athleticism and improving your athletic outputs over time, some of these exercises are completely unique and completely irreplaceable in your program. So let's get straight into it. First exercise, we have got acceleration sprinting. Acceleration sprinting obviously is going to go into the S tier. Acceleration sprinting is trying to increase your velocity as quickly as possible over short distances. We're talking anywhere from, like, some people may even say 5 to 30, 40, or 50 meters, depending on the type of athlete. This could be something like a weighted or resisted sprint, a hill sprint. Only real limiting factor for your performance in acceleration sprints is how fast you are, your elasticity towards the latter end of the sprint, your explosiveness, your rate of force development, foot and ankle stiffness, your ability to project the hips horizontally as far as possible, and then obviously other qualities such as balance, coordination, timing, and then even also explosive strength and starting strength off of those first few steps. You cannot replace the stimulus that sprinting provides in the human body. Acceleration sprinting and max velocity sprinting, which we'll cover a bit later, are obviously a bit different, but nonetheless, it's irreplaceable. If you didn't have acceleration sprinting in your programming, then you're missing a massive trick for developing your athleticism, which is why it goes into the S tier. Next, we have vertical impulse dominant plyometrics with a full approach. So this is distinct from something like a box jump, which we have next. With a box jump, it's what we would call a static jump. There's no horizontal displacement before you're doing the jump. So there's a much smaller reliance on the stretch shortening cycle or the elasticity of the jumping mechanism. Whereas if you're doing a full approach jump in order to touch a high object, dunk a basketball, or do some other kind of athletic feat with a run-up, you're always going to jump higher with a run-up because you're coming into the jumping action with more energy, and you're basically trying to convert that energy into vertical impulse, horizontal momentum. You're trying to convert horizontal momentum into a vertical impulse spike. Again, this is a stimulus that literally cannot be replaced by anything in the gym. It cannot be replaced by any kind of isometric. It cannot be replaced by any kind of isolation exercise or even, heavy compound exercise. And it's going to move the needle for your athleticism. If you want to jump higher, then guess what? The best way to do it is just to practice jump higher. Specificity, specific adaptations to imposed demands. If you want to jump higher, go try and jump higher. Go try and touch a high object. Go and try and dunk a basketball. Things of this nature with a full approach. It's going to work on your it's going to work on your elasticity. It's going to improve your tendon stiffness. It's going to improve your coordination. It's going to improve, obviously, your ability to jump and your ability to produce outputs. And just verticality is a very, very important component of athleticism. That brings me on to the next exercise, which is static jumps, or I guess in this context, we're talking about static box jumps. So just standing next to a box, squatting down, and then jumping up as high as you possibly can. I think box jumps get a bad rap in the S&C world. I think that obviously they're not a true plyometric. You're not really utilizing the stretch shortening cycle as much as you are with the elastic jumps in the higher tiers on this list. But if you, for example, were doing an S&C program, again, I hope you wouldn't be doing this, but if you were doing an S&C program and you were doing literally no exercises whatsoever that involved some kind of jumping, so let's say you were just doing like Olympic weightlifting, you were squatting, you were deadlifting, and you're doing like pressing and pulling exercises bilaterally, and you only implemented box jumps, I have to say that you would probably increase your athleticism even just a small amount. But adding in some kind of jumping to your programming, even if it is just jumping onto a box, is going to have a measurable increase in the needle moving aspect of these exercises. So for box jumps or static jumps that don't rely on the stretch shortening cycle as much, we're going to put them into the A tier for improving general outputs, athleticism. Next, we have light-weighted jumps. Light-weighted jumps. So this guy in the image here, I don't know if you can see it super well, but he is holding very light dumbbells, and he's also not jumping particularly high either. I am of the opinion, again, debate me in the comments if you want to, but I am of the opinion that if you want to do weighted jumps, they need to be loaded heavier rather than lighter. I'm just going to put these here and do them next to each other for the sake of comparison. The guy here on the left, he has light implements in his hand. He's probably got like a 2.5 to 5 kilo dumbbell in each hand. The guy on the right here has probably got a very maximally loaded bar. That looks like it could be up to 120 kilograms, probably 125 kilograms. Which of these exercises do you think has a greater stimulus on the human body? The guy holding the 2.5 kilo dumbbells, or the guy maximally loading a bar on his back and trying to just jump as high as he can with that weight? Light loaded definitely has to go into the C tier. Yeah, there's still going to be some stretch shortening cycle loading. Yeah, it's going to be a somewhat okay stimulus. But if you're going to load an exercise, just know that you're massively decreasing the velocity and you're massively decreasing the rate of force development aspect of that exercise. You're massively decreasing the capacity of that exercise to have progressive overload in terms of the amount of force, the amount of time that gravity has to act on your body. If you want to get better at jumping, loading your body up with weight is not necessarily the best way to go about doing that, because the most amount of power that your body can put out is when it's unloaded. If you want to sprint as fast as possible and run at the highest velocity possible with max velocity sprints, loading your body is not the best way to do that. If you want to produce the most power and run as fast as you can, or if you want to jump as high as you can and have the best specificity to a sporting activity, loading the body with weight is not the way to do that. However, if you want to produce a very large output and you want to produce a significant amount of power on more on the force end of the spectrum, the force velocity curve, if you want to produce more force on the force end of the spectrum, then absolutely you want to be loading as much weight as possible and make weight the limiting factor. Like, how heavy can you load yourself with a barbell or a trap bar? and still be able to leave the floor. That's going to drive high intent. That's going to produce an irreplaceable stimulus on the human body. And that is why I would put a heavily loaded weighted jump into the A tier. Moving on. Extended hold isometrics. So this is something like, as you can see here, a split lunge isometric where you're holding it for 45 seconds, a minute, up to 2 minutes, 3 minutes. I've even seen some people hold this for up to like 5 minutes. But generally, I don't think anyone's kidding themselves into thinking that, well, unless you're confused, of course, that this is going to directly increase your athleticism. This is what we would call like a rehabilitation exercise or a therapeutic exercise. Something like a wall sit or like a quarter squat isometric, where you're just holding a position with body weight or very light load for an extended period of time. This is going to increase blood flow into your tendons. It's going to improve the health of your tendons. It's also got mental benefits if you're trying to hold it for as long as you can and you're really pushing the boundaries of what you think is possible for your body by holding it for an extended period of time. And there's definitely benefits in all of those contexts, but for outputs and just direct needle moving quality in your athleticism, that has to go into the D tier. Next, we have isolation exercises. So this guy here is doing, I believe, is a preacher curl or concentration curl. I have no idea what that is. Some kind of curling exercise, but any kind of exercise that is isolating a single muscle group with a very like minor joint action. I think even within this category of exercise, you could even make a distinction between like lower body isolation exercises and upper body isolation exercises. I make the same distinction between compound exercises as well. Upper body compound exercises and lower body compound exercises, I would definitely not categorize into the same tier. Your lower body is obviously much more important for the development of explosive output athleticism. You run on your legs, you jump on your legs, you sprint on your legs. You cannot do athletic feats without your legs. And there's argument that you can't do without your upper body, but there's no denying that your lower body is more important for explosive output athleticism than your upper body is. So maybe I should have categorized this into two categories, like upper body isolation exercises, lower body isolation exercises. But that being said, for needle moving qualities, compound exercises are king, isolation exercises are accessories. You need to be focusing on the compounds first and then deciding which isolation exercises are going to complement. But if you entirely removed all isolation exercises that are only targeting one small muscle group at a time from your program and just kept your compounds in, the 80-20 principle, the Pareto principle, 80% of your results come from 20% of your exercises. Isolation exercises are definitely a part of that 80% of your inputs, but compound exercises, sprints, jumps, needle moving exercises obviously would be part of that 20%. So for this specific reason, isolation exercises are going to go into the C tier along with light loaded jumps. Okay, next we have unilateral loaded squatting pattern exercises. So obviously this is a heavy compound movement. This is a movement that's going to target a lot of the primary movers for the athletic outputs that we're talking about. You're going to hit your quads, you're going to hit your glutes, there's going to be a stability aspect, you're going to hit adductors. You have to work on balance and coordination, but it's also still a broad general movement pattern that is utilized in a lot of movements. I'm going to put a unilateral exercise into the B tier for the only reason that you cannot load it with as much weight, and because it's less stable, and because it cannot be loaded with as much weight, it's not going to produce the same magnitude of stimulus on the human body as a bilateral squatting will. So just for the sake of comparison here, let's just put bilateral squatting next so that we can see the comparison and the reason why I'm categorizing them into different tiers. Unilateral squatting, lunges, rear elevated split squats, reverse lunges, forward lunges, lateral lunges, things of this nature. The stability of the exercise is the biggest limiting factor for the amount of load that you can load on the bar. And when it comes to producing outputs, when it comes to jumping higher, sprinting faster, lifting heavier, and you want to increase your strength or the force end of the force velocity curve, then a lower body bilateral exercise is always going to be more effective at increasing the amount of force that your body can put out and directly doing that than a unilateral exercise. If you had to pick between the two exercises, if I could only do one or the other, obviously any strength coach that is worth their salt would always pick a bilateral exercise than a unilateral exercise, because you can still train the same muscle groups and you can train them with more load. You can produce more force because there's more stability, and there's also just more progression. There's more room for progression with a barbell squatting, bilateral squatting exercise than there is a unilateral squatting exercise over time, because of just how much more stable the exercise is. And so for that reason, a bilateral squatting variant, again, which could be something like a Zercher, a front squat, a back squat, an SSB, a Hatfield, something of this nature, then obviously that's going to be more stable than a unilateral squatting exercise. Hence why it's going into the A tier and not the B tier. Next, we've got non-linear sprinting or agility sprinting, something where you're trying to move as fast as possible, but not in a straight line, perhaps with multiple changes of direction, multiple efforts. Maybe even curvilinear sprinting would be considered into this category. As you can see, and you can probably guess it from the other exercises in the S tier, this is going into the S tier as well, because it's an irreplaceable stimulus. You literally cannot replace an agility exercise in the weight room, and it also has very, very high specificity and carryover into sport activities. Some sporting activities literally are very similar to the drills that you would do in an agility drill or some kind of agility focused sprinting exercise. Doing a really, really fast sprint and then having to change speed on a dime, either 180 degrees, turning back on yourself, or making a cut and changing your angle by 45 degrees, especially if you can do this in a reactive situation where you're trying to do it with an opponent, you're trying to be evasive, perhaps trying to do it around cones or in like a real life sporting drill situation. Completely irreplaceable for speed and agility and quickness, coordination, timing as well. Timing of producing high outputs is very, very crucial as well. Nothing's going to be able to replace that. So for that reason, it's going into the S tier. Next, we have core exercises, direct core training. So like this guy's here, he's training his abdominal muscles by doing some kind of leg raise. Maybe he's doing a pull-up, I'm not sure. But from this picture, it looks like he's doing some kind of direct core training. And there is often debate about whether direct core training is strictly necessary. I think that if we're talking about core muscles, there is no strict difference between a core muscle. There's nothing special or unique about core muscles in comparison to other skeletal muscles. So for that reason, if you want to train core muscles, something like a plank or some kind of Palloff hold, like a anti-rotation or like anti-flexion, anti-extension, anti-lateral flexion type of exercise where you're just statically holding a movement, really is definitely not going to move the needle. But if you're talking about something like a leg raise, something that's going to cause flexion, and you're loading that with as much weight as you possibly can, lateral flexion or rotation, the movements of the core, which is essentially in the same way as you would train any other skeletal muscle, loading it with as much weight as possible, stretch and squeeze, as much range of motion as possible as well, then in that context, I think the core exercises are very beneficial, but there's no way I can look at you with a straight face and tell you that they're going to be any more important than an isolation exercise. So for that reason, direct core training, it's an isolation exercise. It's going to be in the same category as all the other isolation exercises into the C tier. Next, we've got unilateral hinging. So as I said before, unilateral exercises are less stable than bilateral exercises. Still important, still have a very important place in athletic programming, but obviously they're always going to be a subsidiary or accessory exercise to bilateral exercises. Bilateral compounds are always king in comparison to unilateral compound exercises. And so for that reason, unilateral hinging is going to go into the same tier as unilateral squatting. Next, we've got vertical pulling exercises. So this could be like a lat pull down, a weighted pull up. Bilateral exercises in comparison to unilateral exercises, as I said before, are better, but lower body exercises in comparison to upper body exercises are more important for developing your athleticism. If you had to choose between, and for the vast majority of athletes, this is if you had to choose between lower body dominant exercises and upper body dominant exercises. Cars drive on their wheels. The lower body is more important for producing athletic outputs than upper body is. For that reason, I'm going to put a bilateral pulling exercise, such as pull-ups or pull down, into the C tier. Next, we have linear maximal sprinting. Essentially trying to, once you've reached the fastest possible velocity that you can run at, trying to just maintain that for a given distance. So this could be something like 40 meters, like a 30-meter fly, 10-meter fly, 20-meter fly, reaching a maximal distance and just trying to maintain that for 10 meters, 20 meters, 30 meters, 40 meters, or something like a 100-meter sprint, something like a 200-meter sprint, 150-meter sprint. This, obviously, as I said, is going to go into the S tier. You can't put acceleration and not top speed into the S tier. It's an irreplaceable stimulus on the human body. The sheer forces that are going through your body as you're running fast, the peak forces in the ground contacts, the elasticity that you're going to get through your tendons when you're moving at these velocities. The stretch shortening cycle, the reliance on the stretch shortening cycle is arguably the most maximal when you're doing a max velocity sprint. A lot of people have said that maximal velocity sprinting, or sprinting in general, but I would further categorize it into max velocity sprinting, that max velocity sprinting is the most potent plyometric stimulus that you can have on the human body, because the ground contact times are the shortest, the peak forces are the highest at those moments when you have the amortization phase, when the foot hits the ground, and all of that force is then being redirected from the ground back into your foot. Your tendons have to be maximally elastic. I think I remember seeing some statistic that the ground contact time is somewhere in the region of like 80 milliseconds, like 0.08 seconds, if I'm not mistaken. That's a very, very short amount of time for your body to have to produce and redirect force back into the ground. And obviously, other benefits of max velocity sprinting is that you get hormonal benefit. You get hormonal benefits from a lot of the exercises here, but like the sheer forces and the potency of the stimulus on the human body literally cannot be replaced by any other exercise on this list. The elasticity of the foot and ankle complex is going to be maximally increased. The health of the hamstring and the hip flexors. There's a whole litany of benefits for max velocity sprinting that I could just create a whole video about, just talking about them. But obviously, it has to go into the S tier along with all of the other exercises in the S tier. Highly stretch shortening cycle dominant exercises, high velocity exercises, and high peak force exercises that literally cannot be replaced by anything else. Next up, we have static or counter movement jumps, in which we are not trying to jump onto a box, which is why I would distinguish this from like a box jump, as we said earlier, but we're just trying to jump as high as we can. So this could be something like a vertical jump, like a static jump where you're trying to just squat down, like jump, like triple flex down, get down as fast as you can, and then just jump up as high as you can, either with arms to help you or just hands on your hips. I would say that this is a tier exercise as well, if we're using the same logic as we defined box jumps. I don't think there's much more to say about this, as it is largely a similar exercise to a box jump. It's just the goal of the exercise is a little bit different. So moving on, we have bilateral vertical pressing. For the same logic as I've defined earlier in the list, this cannot be categorized higher or lower in the C tier because of the same logic I applied to vertical pulling exercises. I couldn't put like a vertical pressing exercise in the B tier and not have, the vertical pulling exercises in the B tier. But I wouldn't say that it's more important than a lunge, for instance, in athletic programming. Maybe I'm, making a claim here that you need to decide between the two. But if I had to decide between the two, I would obviously pick a unilateral hinging or lunging exercise over a bilateral pressing or pulling exercise when it comes to the development of outputs in your athleticism. But for that reason, it's going in the C tier. Next, we have static horizontal jumps. So we're talking about something like a broad jump or a single leg broad jump, something where you're stationary before you jump, you're trying to jump horizontally as far as humanly possible. So this is going to be in the same category as vertical dominant static jumps. So counter movement jumps, the off vert jumps, like off vert dunk, standing hurdle jump, or a standing box jump. It's just the same thing, but you're trying to jump horizontally with a horizontal emphasis rather than a vertical emphasis. Naturally, I would say that this would be higher in this tier than a vertical impulse jump, because if you're going to try and jump horizontally as far as you can, there's naturally going to be a vertical impulse anyway, because you're trying to jump as high and as far as you can at the same time. Obviously, you're trying to jump as far as possible, but you can't jump horizontally without jumping vertically. So for that reason, if I had to pick between the two, like a static box jump or like broad jumps, I would pick broad jumps because they're covering more bases. They're more holistic than just a static box jump. But even so, they're still not in the same category as a lot of the other exercises in S tier because of the lack of horizontal displacement before you get into the jump. So as I've done previously in the video, let's compare elastic or horizontal dominant plyometrics, where you're trying to cover as much ground as you can while moving at velocity. You have horizontal displacement before you start the exercise, before you start the jumping and the efforts, and then you're just trying to carry as much of that horizontal momentum into each subsequent jump. This could be like a triple broad jump or like a quintuple broad jump. You're trying to start off with one jump, but then you're trying to maintain the momentum, and then with each subsequent jump or each subsequent muscular effort or elastic effort, you're trying to cover as much horizontal distance as possible every single time. So this could be something like a bound, a triple broad jump, triple jump, long jump, any kind of exercise in which you are trying to build up some speed, and then with every effort you're just trying to, I'm repeating myself here, but you get the idea. It's a more elastic exercise. It requires more stretch shortening cycle efficiency, and for that reason it's going to provide a much more specific benefit to increasing the outputs in terms of athletic outputs. Becoming a more well-rounded athlete, I don't think you could have a program without horizontal dominant plyometrics, such as triple jump, triple broad jump, single leg bounding, hopping, skipping, things of this nature. Obviously, it has to go into the S tier by the same logic as all the other exercises in the S tier, and that's why I would categorize these over broad jumps. Again, you could probably split hairs over the sporting activity, but I'm talking about for the vast majority of sports across many different disciplines. If I had to pick between a static broad jump or the stretch shortening cycle dominant, the more elastic, like shorter ground contact times of bounding, single leg bounding, skips, hops, triple jump, broad jump, triple broad jump, I would obviously pick that over the broad jumps. Luckily, we don't exist in a situation where that's the case, but for the case of this like hypothetical thought experiment, then yes, I would pick that over the broad jumps. Moving on, we have so what I would categorize this like series of exercises is like weighted mobility, loaded stretching, extreme range of motion exercises that are still loaded. For example, an ATG split squat, some kind of like loaded hip flexor raise through an extended range of motion. Things like a weighted 1990 stretch, some kind of, I don't know, like a super long range of motion Jefferson curl where you're trying to get as much spinal flexion as possible. The kind of exercises that you see on Instagram and they get a bunch of likes, they get a bunch of comments, everyone shares them because they look kind of extreme. You're working on your mobility, you're kind of like pushing the extremes of your range of motion while also adding load. I think that they look cool, and there's definitely a therapeutic and prehab benefit to these exercises. But if you think about these exercises, because of the extreme range of motion and because of the loading potential and the instability of these exercises, what is the actual needle moving aspect of these exercises for athleticism? This is my biggest gripe with the ATG system. Ben Patrick, I love the guy. He's done a lot for the development of, prehab and rehabilitation. He's probably helped heal thousands upon thousands of athletes' knees and got them back into jumping. But he's also inadvertently spread misinformation about what exercises actually are going to make you jump higher. I don't think anyone's kidding themselves into thinking that, well, I think a lot of people actually are, but a lot of people, and this frustrates me in the S&C world, that a tib raise or an ATG split squat or some kind of like sissy squat variation where you're pushing your knees all the way over your toes is going to directly make you jump higher for basketball. If you want to jump higher for basketball, you need to be doing sprints, you need to be doing jumps, you need to be doing plyometrics, bounds, acceleration sprints, static jumps, weighted jumps, bilateral squatting, bilateral hinging. First, you need to be, unilateral squatting. I don't think we can even say that this would even be considered in the same tier as any of those exercises. There's no way in hell that you could put those even above like bilateral pressing exercises, because at least if you're comparing these exercises to like a bilateral press or a bilateral pull, force outputs are going to be higher and the potential for progression is much higher with all of these exercises. Hey, I may be wrong here, but you can definitely not make an argument for why this would be anything higher than a C tier, potentially even D tier. So for this reason, I'm going to put this exercise into, I want to say high D tier. I'm going to be a little bit more kind to this category of exercise. I'm going to put them in the low C tier, but definitely cannot be considered above a lot of these other isolation exercises, direct core training, bilateral pressing and pulling vertically, horizontally. I'm going to do these last two, reel them off pretty quick, because it's the same logic as I said before with vertical pulling and vertical pressing. We've got horizontal pressing going into the C tier, and we've got horizontal pulling also going into the C tier. Same logic. I don't think there's any way to like say that any of these exercises is particularly more important than another. Obviously, depending on the sport, it will make a big difference. But for just general across all sports, if you want to become more athletic, these exercises do need to be in your program, but I wouldn't say that they're more important than lower body exercises, even if they are unilateral exercises. Next, we have extensive plyometrics. Extensive plyometrics, I had a little bit of a difficult time categorizing these on this list because they aren't necessarily the most needle moving in terms of outputs, in terms of the quality, like in the qualitative, if we're looking at them qualitatively and comparing them to other exercises, like are they going to increase the elasticity of your joints in the same way as sprinting or jumping will? Absolutely not. Are they going to increase the force component of your the lower leg, the calf, the foot and ankle complex in the same way as a calf raise will? Absolutely not. But is there still a quantitative benefit to these if you're doing them with a relatively high volume? They're kind of like a filler exercise where you can kind of do a very, very large amount of them, and because you're doing so much of them, then that is going to be increasing the elasticity of the foot and ankle complex by just having loads and loads of submaximal ground contacts. There's an argument that you don't even need to have these in a program if you're doing plenty of sports play. If you're playing a field sport, if you're playing like rugby, football, basketball, court sport, badminton, table tennis, where you're just practicing your sport and you're doing that with a high enough volume and frequency every single week. And there's even an argument to be made that you don't even necessarily need extensive plyometrics like pogos, single leg pogos, like line hops, star jump drill, where you're trying to jump, multiple different directions. Deep tier plyometrics. I think I should have made a separate category for these, but even so, all of these exercises are they're very useful if you don't have a very big background of like elastic ground contacts. And I would always err on the side of like slightly higher intensity extensive plyometrics over lower intensity ones. So I'm talking like maybe like very small, tiny little hurdle hops where you're trying to like pogo over them with the shortest ground contact time possible. You're really trying to maximize the stretch shortening cycle, but there's not like massive counter movements or joint actions happening like with massive range of motion. You're just trying to be very stiff in the landings. I think there's an argument to be made in the value of those even for sports and field athletes, but I think these would also have to go into the high C tier along with weighted jumps. I would argue they're more important than weighted jumps. Oh, I didn't go in there. Um, yeah, so high C tier, definitely important. And I think depending on the athlete, it could be higher. But if we're comparing that to the sprints, jumps, and plyometrics that we have in the A tier and the S tier, no one's kidding themselves into thinking that some pogos are going to make them jump higher than actually practicing jumping high, or sprint faster than actually sprinting fast. They're an accessory plyometric exercise if we want to categorize them in that sense. Next, we have Olympic weightlifting movements. Categorize them all into one category here for the sake of brevity. So this is like a snatch, a power snatch, a clean, a power clean, a jerk, power jerk, a split jerk, a full clean, a full snatch, any of the hang variations off the blocks, off the floor, from the high hang, from the low hang, any of the variations in which you are doing one of the Olympic weightlifting movements or variations. These often debated among S&C coaches, very hotly debated, that actually they're often argued to be not high enough force, like not the same amount of like force producing capacity as a bilateral squat or deadlift, but not enough. So they're not the high enough force to produce like a force increasing quality over a squat, and they're not like high enough velocity or like power output, quote unquote, to produce the stimulus and the benefit as a sprint or a jump. Now, I am of the opinion that they are still an irreplaceable stimulus, regardless of whether that's true or not. I do think that that's true. I think that they do have still very, very high peak forces and very high power output, especially in the power position right before triple extension in the second pull. As you're pulling the bar from the knees up into the contact position, there is an extreme amount of power happening at that point. The rate of force development is also incredibly high. And I'm not going to lie, there is also a very technical component to them, but I think that's actually to their benefit. Yes, a lot of athletes don't give a crap about training, and they just want to get better at their sport. But I think that there's definitely benefit to learning a novel movement pattern and learning something like a snatch or a clean and jerk, and learning how to produce force in that context and to be explosive and to be powerful in that context. I have to put these into A tier. I think that they are arguably more valuable than unilateral squatting and hinging. Definitely wouldn't put them above like bilateral squatting or jumps. I would say that they are, depending on the athlete, arguably more valuable than heavily loaded jumps, or potentially equivalent to heavily loaded jumps. But in terms of the actual stimulus on the body, they're entirely unique. There's no comparable stimulus on the human body and also in terms of like time and efficiency, there's no comparable stimulus for just general physical preparation, covering as many bases as possible as Olympic weightlifting movements are. I could do a whole video on the benefits of Olympic weightlifting movements for athletic development, but they are a very unique stimulus and they cannot be replaced by something like a loaded jump. So for that reason, I put them into the A tier. Come at me in the comments if you think I'm being stupid and they should be way lower. But they're very polarizing. I'm much more of like I'm an optimist when it comes to Olympic weightlifting movements. I think that they definitely have more utility than a lot of people say they do. But then again, there's also the argument to be made that you can have an excellent athletic development program without having Olympic weightlifting movements in your program as well. You can create an excellent athletic development program without ever touching a barbell with the intent of doing a snatch or a clean and jerk. But I'm going to put them in the A tier for that reason. Nonetheless, let's move on. We have overcoming isometrics now. Overcoming isometrics, there could be something like a pin quarter squat. It's something like a rack pull, something like here where you've got a chain and you're on a platform and you've got some kind of measurement device. A single leg quarter squat, isometric, anything where you're pushing or pulling on an immovable object with the intent of producing as much force in a specific joint angle as possible. I would say that these have to go, or I think I've just realized I moved that into the C tier without realizing. I would have to say that these are going to be into I have to say C tier. Yes, you're going to produce very, very high amounts of peak force. But there's a lot of debate as to the effectiveness of this on the development of your athleticism. Yes, you're producing a very high amount of peak force in a specific joint angle, but there's no plyometric movement in there. It's not through any range of motion whatsoever. I would say that this has a benefit for if you have a sticking point in a squat or a deadlift, and then doing like an isometric there. It has a benefit for being an accessory for strength exercises like high force exercises, because it takes you a pretty long time to reach peak forces in an overcoming isometric. If you ever look at the force curve, it takes quite a long time before you actually reach peak force, in the same way as you're doing like a deadlift. If you're like pulling on a bar, it actually takes a few seconds. It can sometimes take a few seconds for you to complete the entirety of the lift because the velocity is so low. So if if you actually want to achieve peak forces, then it might take you like 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds sometimes to reach a peak force in an overcoming isometric. And so for that reason, there is an argument that this isn't going to have much utility for translating these movement or this specific exercise into your sprints and your jumps and your plyometrics or your sporting activities. I think that there's plenty of athletes that have done programs that haven't had overcoming isometrics in them, and they've done perfectly well. But there's also great athletes who have done overcoming isometrics, and they tout the benefits of them. I can't sit here with a straight face and tell you that they're going to be better than anything in the A tier. I wouldn't put them over anything in the A tier or even the B tier. So for that reason, I have put them into the C tier. Okay, moving on. We have got depth jumps. So jumping off of an object, landing, absorbing that force, and then maximally using that force to then create as much horizontal or vertical displacement as you possibly can. I think I've put this into a separate category for the specific reason that they are kind of their own category of exercise. The main form of progressive overload here is gravity. Obviously, the height of your box. The higher the box, the more time you have to fall to earth, the more time you're accelerating towards the ground, and therefore the higher the forces and the faster you're going to have to troll. Maybe not necessarily faster, but the more force you're going to have to redirect, you're going to have to absorb and then redirect back into the ground and turn that into like vertical impulse or horizontal impulse. I think that depending on the way that they're programmed and depending on the type, they could be higher or lower on the tiers. But I think these are going to have to go into the A tier. 2 depth jumps are a fantastic way to improve the efficiency and the quality of your stretch shortening cycle. So for that reason, they're going to go into the A tier, especially if they're like single effort jumps rather than multiple effort jumps. You can do like multi-effort depth jumps or multi-effort jumps where the primary emphasis is springing off the floor as much as possible or maximal displacement from the floor or horizontally as possible. They're still very, very valuable, and I would say that they're more important than a lot of the other exercises on this list. So for that reason, they're going into the A tier. Next up, we have bilateral hinging. This obviously is going to go into the A tier right next to bilateral squatting. There's an argument to be made that squatting is more important than hinging when it comes to athletic development, in terms of the utilization of the primary movers around the knee and like getting full range of flexion at the knee. There's even arguments to be made that certain variants of squatting are more conducive to athletic development than other ones, but I'm not going to split hairs here in the context of this video and in the context of long-term, like broad scope, broad picture athletic development. Squatting and hinging are largely equivalent. Obviously, bilateral is more important than unilateral, and so for that reason, it's going to go right into squatting in the A tier. Next, we have altitude drops. So this is kind of similar to a depth jump. It's just a way more intense activity. You're jumping off of a very, very high box, like much higher than what your maximum vertical jump could be. And you're not doing anything after the landing other than just landing and just trying to absorb that force, either as stiffly as possible with as little yielding in the knees and hips and ankles as possible, or with a decent amount of yielding, like trying to make it a little bit more of a muscular action rather than a tendon action. So if you land stiff, your tendons are going to be taking a lot of that force. Very, very good for improving the elasticity of tendons, improving the force absorption capacity of like the soft tissue, tendons, your ligaments, your fascia to a certain extent, but a bit less so your muscles. Or you're going to be doing more yielding, in which case it's a more muscular action because more of that force is being absorbed into your muscles. There's benefits and pros and cons to each. But for the same reason as I've put depth jumps into the A tier, um, yes, I mean, I'm kind of torn between whether I should put this into the A tier or the B tier because there is definitely utility in doing these, but are they as irreplaceable in a program as other more true plyometrics or other weight-bearing exercises? Like if I had to pick between an altitude drop and a squat, I would still say that they're in the A tier because just because of the sheer amount of force that you can do in doing these exercises, jumping off of a high box, landing and landing in a deep squat or landing in a very stiff quarter squat, that is still going to have a comparable effect on the tissues of your lower body. And the stimulus of that is very, very extreme, very, very potent, then absolutely this would go in the higher tiers. But if I had to pick between this and like a unilateral squatting exercise, I'm kind of torn. I'm saying I'm kind of torn between like low A tier, high B tier comparison to some of the other exercises on this list. I'm going to be kind to altitude drops. I'm going to put them in low A tier. And then last of all, we have hurdle jumps. I probably should have categorized these with vertical dominant plyometrics, but I'm talking about vertical dominant, like plyometric, where you're coming at it with an approach. You're trying to clear the highest hurdle you possibly can with your legs. I would have to put these into the S tier as well, obviously, because of the same reasons as you would do any other kind of approach into a vertical jump. You have a maximal target that you're trying to clear with a single jump with a full approach. You're trying to convert as much of your horizontal momentum into a vertical impulse spike as possible. Only difference is the action after you jump. With a vertical jump where you're trying to go linearly vertical and like reach or touch a high object, get your head towards the rim, a vert check or a height check. You don't have to worry about flexing your legs up afterwards. But with a hurdle jump, then naturally you are trying to lift your legs afterwards. I think there's definitely benefit to doing something kind of acrobatic after a jump, like maybe a flip or some kind of like gymnastic movement. Hurdle jump isn't necessarily the same as that, but doing something after you've jumped and left the ground, and having to move your body in a very specific way. Otherwise, you're not completing the jump successfully. You fail the jump if you don't clear the hurdle, then there's definitely some intent driving benefit to that as well. One thing I want to change about the list quickly, I want to put all of the bilateral upper body strength exercises into the B tier as opposed to the A tier, purely because of the force producing capacity of the upper body and developing that over the long term. Obviously, you can't say that they're more important than squatting and hinging. Some people may say that they're equivalent, but I think that they're definitely of higher importance and of a higher priority than a lot of the exercises in the C tier, because they are still they are still developing the force producing capacity of the upper body, which is still important. Don't get me wrong, it's not as important as a lot of the other exercises higher in the list, but they are still important. So I apologize for miscategorizing them earlier and maybe confusing you guys. So that is the tier list. Hopefully you guys got some value out of this video and you're now a bit less confused about programming with a hierarchy of exercises for your athletes or for yourself. We could split hairs about some of the exercises on this list, and I'm very open to a productive debate in the comments. Or if anyone wants to DM me on Instagram and talk about this, but that's my list for now. Before we go, if you want to sprint faster, jump higher, lift heavier, become a well-rounded, explosive, and powerful athlete, then I have literally created a program for that specific purpose. So if you're interested in that program, then check the link in the description. One more thing I did not mention here is the use of conditioning exercises. Conditioning exercises, I believe, they exist within their own category for athletic development. These types of exercises that we're talking here, strength exercises, plyometric exercises, These are more about the mechanics of the actual exercises themselves, the physics and mechanics of the exercises, whereas when we're looking at conditioning, that's more about the mechanics of your metabolic system. So it's less about what the mechanics of your exercise are, it's more to do with the impact of that exercise on your metabolic system. So at some point in the future, I will have a tier list for conditioning exercises, for the development of athleticism, or just conditioning exercises tier list, but it's not particularly my area of specialty. I'm more focused on explosive, powerful athletic development, explosive development of your athleticism over the long term. So thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next one.